Alright guys, in this project we're going to create a hoverboard. So it's just kind of a cool little effect. We're going to paint these boxes onto the screen, we're going to style them with CSS, and we're going to basically set a certain number. So right now it's set to 500 in the JavaScript, and it's going to paint that number of boxes. And then we're going to have event listeners for mouse over and mouse out, so that when we hover over, it's going to give us a random color. Okay, so you can see if I hover over that, it's blue, then it's purple. So we'll have an array of colors that we'll basically have to choose from for each box when we hover over it. So it gives us this cool effect. And this could be used for some kind of drawing application or something like that. We'll be using CSS transitions, so we have that cool fade out effect as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and start on this hoverboard project. So in the HTML here, let's change the title up to hoverboard. And all we're going to have in this HTML is a class of container, because in this container we're going to have a bunch of divs with the class of square, like this. In fact, what I'll do is I'll put some in here now, but later on we're going to get rid of these because they're going to get inserted via JavaScript, and we're going to set a certain amount of squares to be painted onto the screen. So for now we'll just throw these in, and let's jump into our style sheet. And let's see, for the body here, let's set a background, and I'm going to set that to 111. So I mean, font doesn't really matter. We're not having any fonts here. If you want to add some text or something, you can, but I'm just going to get rid of all that. We don't need it. Okay, and then let's do display flex, and we don't need column. Just to put everything in the middle, we're going to keep this. And then we have the container, which actually gave it a class. Let's give it an ID as well. So ID container, because I'm going to use that for the JavaScript. And then here, let's say class container, and we want to display flex. Actually, before we do the container, let's do the squares. So I'm just gonna comment that out for a second, and then let's add our square class and set a background color. And background color, I'm gonna set this to hexadecimal 1D 3 times. So let's see, we can't see anything just yet. Let's add a box shadow of 0, 0 for the offsets, 2 pixel blur, and black. Okay, and then for us to be able to see these squares, we have to add a height and a width. So let's give these a height and a width of 16 pixels. So we'll do height, width of 16. Good, so now we can at least see the squares. I'm going to just add a margin of 2 pixels as well, just pull them apart a little bit. And we're going to want to transition, so ultimately we're going to paint these on the screen, and then we're going to make it so that when we enter, it turns a certain color, a random color, and when we leave it, it gets rid of that color. And we want that to happen at kind of with a little fade effect. So I'm going to add a transition here for, let's say, 2 seconds ease. And let's also set for the square hover. So when we hover over it, I'm going to set the transition duration to 0 seconds, so that we have an effect where when we hover over it, it immediately lights up, and then when we come off of it, it will basically take 2 seconds for the color to disappear, so it'll have that fade effect. Okay, we're not going to see that just yet, but we'll get to that. So the container, let's see, we want to display flex. As soon as I do that, it's going to display in a row. And I just want to set align items to center and justify content to center. And I want these to wrap, so we'll set flex wrap to wrap. We're not going to see a difference now because we don't have that many boxes. But we want to give this a max width of 400 pixels. Okay, so if it goes beyond that, then it should wrap onto the next line. So just to test that out, let's take these and let's create a bunch of them and save. And now you can see when it gets past that 400 pixels or whatever, it will wrap onto the next line. Okay, so that looks good. I think that's all we need to do for the CSS. So let's clear out all of these squares, because like I said, we're going to paint them with the JavaScript depending on, you know, what we set for the amount of squares. And that's all we need, is just this one container. So in the next video, we'll jump into our JavaScript and we'll get started on that. Alright, so now we have the fun part, which is the JavaScript. So let's jump into script.js, and first thing we want to do is grab the container, which is the only element that we have in the body. So let's say document.getElementById, and that has an ID of container. Now we want to create an array of colors here, because we want these to be random colors when we follow along the squares. So I'm going to just paste in some hexadecimal values. You can use absolutely any colors you want. They can be hexadecimal, they can be RGB, they can be color names, whatever you want. And then we want a variable here. I'm going to give this just all caps here, call this squares, and then the amount of squares that we want to put on the screen, which is going to be 500 in this case. I don't know why I put a semicolon. I don't use semicolons. So those are the variables we need, and then the way we're going to do this is create a for loop. Okay, so we want to say for, and let's let I equal 0. Okay, so it's going to start at 0, and then as long as I is less than whatever we have in squares, and then we want to increment I by 1. So in here we're going to create an element. So let's say const square, and on the document object there's a method called, let's spell this right, document, there's a method called create element, and we can create any type of DOM element that we want. I'm going to create a div, and then I want to add the class of square, so I'm going to take the square element and I'm going to say class list dot add, and I want to add the class of square, because that's, you know, the square, we styled this square class, and that's what we want to show. Now this isn't going to do anything just yet. We want to take the container that we brought in, and we want to append child, because we want to insert this into the container, and we'll pass in here square like that. Okay, now if we save this, you can see that 500 squares have now been painted. If I change this to 200 and I save, now we have 200. So you can change this to whatever you want, but we're going to go ahead and paint 500 squares. And then what we want to happen is when we hover over these, we want to basically have them light up with a random color. So inside this for loop, let's take the square, and I want to add an event listener. So I'm going to say add event listener and pass in the event. In this case is going to be mouse over. So when we just hover over a square, this is going to fire off, and I want this to call a function that we're going to create that says, that's called set color, and we want to pass in that particular square. All right, we want to do the same thing when we leave, so we'll have an event listener on mouse out, so when we leave a square, and then we'll call remove color. Okay, and then let's go down here and let's create function set color and say element, and just for now let's console log here element. So if I save that and I open up my console, let's see, remove color is not defined, so I just need to define remove color element. Alright, so now if I hover over a square, you can see it's just gonna, or I shouldn't say hover, but if I mouse over, it's gonna call that. Alright, if I come out of it, it's gonna call remove color. So So I just do like console log 1, 2, 3, and we go over here. You'll see that each time I get out of a square, it's going to fire this off. All right, so let's get rid of that, and let's do the set color first. So we need to have a specific color. I'm going to have a function called get random color because we don't want it to always be the same one. So down here, let's say function get random color, and we want to return. And remember, we have that colors array, and we can access, like, the 0 index is going to give us this one, then 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want to get a random index. So inside here, instead of hard coding a number, I'm going to say math.floor because I want to round down, and then math.random. So math.random gives me a random decimal. I want to multiply that by the length of the array. So colors.length. That way, it's going to be somewhere in between 0 and 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, in fact, I can go ahead and console log here the color, and if I go over and hover, you'll see that it's going to be one of those colors. Good. So now we just need to set it to the actual square, in this case the element, because the square is getting passed in as the element. So we can set the style. Let's set the style dot background, and we're going to set that equal to whatever the color is. And then also the box shadow. Let's set element. Element dot style dot box shadow. You want to use camel case for this, and we're going to set that to, let's use some backticks here, and it's going to be 0, 0, 2 pixels, and then whatever the color is. So in here we'll pass in the color, and then another shadow, so a comma, 0, 0, 10 pixels, and then whatever the color is. All right, so if I save that, let's close the console up and go over here, and you can see wherever I go, it's going to give me a random color. So you could create like a drawing app with this. You can make them smaller, and you could add some other functionality to it. I just want them to disappear once we come off it, because right now we can fill the whole thing. I mean, if that's what you want to do, that's fine, but I want to remove the color. So what we'll do is when that remove is called, we'll take the element and set the style dot background, and we want to set it back to the original color of the box, which is this right here. Okay, so we're going to set that equal to that color on remove, and then set the box shadow. So element dot style dot box shadow, we're going to set that to the original box shadow, which is this right here. So pass that in here. All right, so let's save that, and now you can see I can go over and get a random color, but it disappears and it fades out like that. It takes 2 seconds to fade out because of this transition right here. Okay, so if I take this transition off, then it's just going to do this, and that is kind of stupid. So we want to leave that trail by doing that, adding that transition. And just like with any other project in this course, I encourage you to add to it. Maybe have a select box where you can choose different color schemes or something like that. I'm sure that you can think of something. This is just a good template to create some kind of drawing application or something like that. All right, so that's it. Let's move on to the next project.